comunità di fare questi pendoli a Nizza Monferrato. Da 10 anni veniamo a Nizza per avere il nostro workshop Spitz-Oener anniversario di 20 anni di CReAM, è un anno nuovo per noi di vivere questa opportunità con la comunità Nizza Monferrato. Tutto questo che facciamo adesso sfortunatamente sarà in inglese, questo è tutto il mio campo di una lingua che parlo bene. So we have an excellent panel here tonight talking about the challenges which face Europeans and also global level. Steve Machin, who will chair it, is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and the director of the Center for Economic Performance in London. He is a fellow of the British Academy and has many distinctive positions in the past. He has also been a member of the minimum wage commission in the United Kingdom and the chair Tito, who due to his understanding is probably a little bit late, is going to host he's professor of economics at the Fortin University, senior visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and engaged in many different associations and projects. Here in Italy, Nicole is most known for its time as the president of the National Social Security Institute, IPS, and of course, also an expert in labor. Farber is the theological professor of economics and an associate of the Industrial Relations at Princeton University. He has worked for many years on labor markets, in particular on unions, on minimum wages, on inequality. He served as the president of the Society for Labor Economics, and for his lifetime achievements, he received the Nizza Prize. Nicole is a professor at the University of Vancouver School of Economics, where she was much engaged in issues related to labor economics. She is an expert on labor economics with a strong emphasis on male female issues in the labor. Alexandra Spitz-Oener, a professor at University and the research associate of the Institute for Employment Research, which is similar to WIPS in this country. She focuses on many issues related to labor economics, labor markets, and finally, Bob Gregory is emeritus professor at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australasian University. Well, in Australia doesn't know Bob. Bob basically is known by everybody, in particular by the slightly more mature generation. He has consulted basically every government for the last 30 years on issues of labor markets and recently even macroeconomics. So Steve will chair this panel, and I think we should all get one.
So welcome everybody. I want to say a couple of things before we start. One is this is the policy panel as part of the conference we're at, which is celebrating 20 years of CReAM, the Centre for Research Analysis and Migration. One Christian didn't introduce one particular person, who is the director of CReAM himself, who has put together such an amazing done huge amounts of things. Many people in the room have something to do with CReAM, and it's sort of tentacles have stretched out in many places across the world, and that will reflect that in terms of what we're going to have on policy panel today. So the conference is brilliant, and it's all going really well, I think, and let's have 20 more meetings as well in the course. Okay. So to the panel itself, we have a set of very eminent speakers here from a whole range of different places. Just introduce them. The theme is going to be, let me get the title right, labour shortages, wages and inequality, policy challenges after COVID. So that's a big area, and we're going to hear various perspectives on this. The way we're going to structure the policy panel is each of the speakers is going to take, each of the four speakers here, to the left of me, not too far left, but to the left of me, four speakers. I'm going to take about 10 minutes to introduce the material what we're talking about. And then Bob will give some remarks about the overall picture. And then we'll open up to some questions, question and Q&A session from the floor. Okay, so let's get going. We're going to begin with Farber. And Tito just coming, so we're going to begin with Hank. And then we're going to have Nicole, Alexandra, followed by Tito, and as I say, then Bob. So over to you, Hank.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Christian, for the generous introduction before. I'm going to give the U.S. perspective a bit and try to make clear why I think what happened in the labor market during the COVID pandemic was unprecedented, really, and what it means for the labor market going forward. So, there's too many words and too many slides for me to go through everything. But this slide is meant to say, look, we had a very sharp, I don't have a pointer, is there a pointer? How do I turn it on? All right, anyway, don't worry about the pointer. I can go back here. Basically, the result was that, demand for services in roughly March, April 2020, demand for services like travel and dining fell dramatically. Many workplaces couldn't remain functioning, even in other industries. The result was a very short-term rise in layoffs, unemployment, and shorter work hours. Much sharper downturn than the usual recession, and a much sharper recovery. And I'm going to show you some slides with graphs on them to make it clear what happened. Okay, and there's, lately, like in Europe, there's been a substantial inflation, and this is where we haven't seen in a long time, and this is going to have important consequences for what we do. How did the labor market respond to COVID? Well, they laid off many workers. Many firms downsized. They didn't have a clear view of how quickly things would recover. They didn't keep workers. I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of places didn't keep workers raw in inventory. So when demand began to come back quickly, firms had to hire new workers. A lot of firms had to hire new workers. And hiring new workers is expensive. You have to search for them, you have to bring them on, and often you have to pay them a higher wage than you're used to paying your existing employees. But firms don't really want to either pay new employees more than existing employees. As a result, firms, and I'm kind of giving you a preview of what I'm including, firms claim many vacancies. So we've all read about how the labor market has a shortage of workers. In economics, there's no such word as a shortage. There's just prices that are too low. In fact, these firms are not paying high enough wages. All right, so now I'm going to show you some documentation for what I just said. I can almost stop here. Look at that spike. That's the layoff rate by month from 2007 to 2021. And if you look carefully around 2009, 2008, 2009, you can see the Great Recession. And it's a small blip. But compare that to what happened in COVID. 2020, that spike is April 2020. Just a dramatic increase. Here's what happened to the unemployment rate, the usual seasonally adjusted U.S. unemployment rate that you see in the news. And there's just this sharp increase from under 4% to over almost 15% in a month or 2 months. And then it just dropped like a stone, really, a lot of the way back to about 7%, and it's continued to decline to the point where now it's back to where it was. This is time for this. The CBS misses a lot of unemployment in a situation like COVID. These are people who, for example, report that they have a job, but they weren't at work because their employer didn't want them that week. And they're counted as employed because they say they have a job. And then there's people who are not in the labor force but want a job for reasons that are different from the usual. And what you can see, the dashed line is my recalculation of the unemployment rate, including these additional people who were missed. And we actually get an unemployment rate of 24% in that one. So I found that incredible. Then this is about full-time workers who report they're usually full-time, but they worked last week part-time because there wasn't enough work for them. And that had a huge spike as well from its normal value of between 1% and 2% to about 10%. So not only did people lose jobs, people with full-time jobs lost hours. Okay, so that's kind of worth thinking about. So what are the lessons? Many jobs were lost, but there was a rapid recovery. The key fact is many employment relations were broken, were destroyed. And this has serious implications for what we're seeing now. There's an increase in inflation that's not just due to this, obviously, it's due to a range of factors, including shifts in the nature of demand in other industries, supply chain problems, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and so on. And then and real wages have fallen, and I'm going to come back to that. A shift in the beverage curve, now that's a mystery. Those of you who are not economists, the beverage curve is the relationship between the vacancy rate and the unemployment rate. And I'm going to show you that what's happened is, at any level of unemployment, there's more vacancies now than there were. And a shift in that curve, and there's an increase in the quit rate, which in the U.S. has been termed the Great Resignation. Many workers are quitting and looking for other opportunities, which I think is a natural confluence of events. But it's also a culmination of a rise in quit rates for almost a decade. Okay? So, I have only a few more minutes and a few more slides. This is the nominal wage, not adjusted for inflation, and it's been on a fairly steady uptick, almost throughout. But nothing much to note there. Here's the real wage, adjusted for inflation, pegging 2007 quarter one at 0. And what you can see is real wages fell in the Great Recession and its aftermath and began to kick up pretty steadily starting in around 2015. And then, since the Great Recession, what you can see, not Great Recession, I'm sorry, since the pandemic, real wages have fallen quite a bit on the order, from 8% higher than in 2007 to only 4% higher than 2007. And that's a result of the inflation. Okay? Now, the quit rate, this is the Great Resignation, you can see the dramatic drop in the quit rate in the pandemic in 2020. And then you can see the steady rise in the quit rate through 2021, and then some moderation this year. And I don't know how to go back. There we go. One thing you should note is in all these slides how different the dynamics look than in the Great Recession, which was a traumatic event for the labor. Okay? So fundamentally, I'm almost done. So he said 1 minute, maybe not 2 minutes. Okay. Many workers were laid off. Most of these workers found other jobs or remained out of the labor market, partly as a result of generous stimulus payments offered by the U.S. government. When demand began to come back, as it quickly did, firms had to hire new workers. Hiring new workers can be expensive. Firms, again, don't want to raise the wages of existing workers. It's very difficult to pay two workers doing the same job at different amounts, even though all university professors know that happens. And firms claim vacancies and worker shortage, but again, it's because the wages are too low. Here's the vacancy rate reported by a survey in the U.S. called the JOLTS. And what you can see is that the vacancy rate in the aftermath of the Great Recession, really has been increasing, by a fair bit. But then it's just shot up after the COVID pandemic. There's just, again, into 2022. And then here is, for those of you who are aficionados who maybe know a little macroeconomics, here's what's called the beverage curve. And the diamonds on the top show the relationship since the pandemic, and the dark circles at the bottom show what it used to be. And what it's simply showing is that all these vacancies are not consistent with the amount of unemployment that we were used to seeing. There's many more vacancies. Okay, so the final remarks, basically, I think I don't need to talk about that, but I'll give you a thought on policy. What are we going to do about this? We've got an economy where workers are quitting and looking for new jobs, where real wages are declining, partly because we have a lot of inflation. And the reason real wages are declining, I think, is because firms they love to pay more money to new workers, but they don't want to pay money to their existing workforce. But the existing workforce is bleeding away through the higher quits. But the firms are claiming that there's a shortage. What do you mean no one wants to work for me for $3 an hour? It's just not realistic. So what can we do about policy? Well, policy is always a hard business. And I keep coming back to labor unions. One of the things we've seen is, particularly in the private sector in the US, where maybe 6% of workers are union members, is that unions are a powerful instrument for helping workers overcome this reluctance of employers to raise the pay of existing workers. And there's an act. So one thing is the possibility to pass labor law reform. This is a political possibility right now. But the PRO Act, which passed the House and is currently sitting dead in the Senate in the US, would streamline the organization process. If anyone's interested, I can talk about the details of the PRO Act. One of the things it would do would be to get rid of the laws that come on Nicole was studying, the right to work laws. And it would help address firms' local market power over their workers. Let me actually finish with a slide. Here we go. There's been a lot written in recent news about how unions in the United States are making a resurgence. And here's union membership, the dark circles, and union coverage, the light diamonds. And you can see that there's no sign of an increase at all. So whatever is going on, it hasn't found its way into the data. And I'm happy to talk later about why that might be as well. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's many things I haven't talked about, like remote work, which is a big deal, and so on.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, and for laying the groundwork in terms of the data and showing that somehow things seem to have gone back to normal in some of these trends. My take is going to be a little different. I'm going to want to emphasize more of policies. And in particular, I want to emphasize the fact that the ills of the labor market, many were actually originated in policies. The lockdown policies that were implemented, closing restaurants, closing retail businesses, were policies. happened is that these policies were implemented differently in different provinces. In BC, where I live, there were barely any lockdown of restaurants. We could continue to go to restaurants wearing masks and social distanciation and things like that. So that the workers in these industries did not suffer the kind of unemployment that was seen in other provinces. And on the other hand, there were other policies such as the border shutdown. The border shutdown, the other travel restrictions in terms of constraints were shutting down the airline industry quite a bit. And there were some occupations, such as airline pilots or flight attendants, that could not necessarily switch to other types of jobs. That was not the case for baggage attendant. Baggage attendant transferred to become anglers at Amazon and did find employment there and laid packages that were a lot less heavy than the baggage industry. So they're not returning to the airline. So there is this labor reallocation, a change of equilibrium. Some of it was driven by policy. Another quite important element of policy in Canada was the income support. There was a very large income support that was given to workers. Here I say that about 2/3 of Canadian adults did receive some benefits, and these benefits were very generous. More than 1 in 3 Canadian workers did receive at least $5,000. And up to close to $15,000 in 2020. And 2/3 of those in food and accommodation did receive these payments. So there were some income effect that allowed these workers to retrain. There are some stories of previously servers decided to upgrade their skills and become web designers and so on. So there is a sense in which you could, if you at any time thought about basic income and how some of the proponents think that, well, this is a way that can break the cycle of working paycheck to paycheck and allow workers, if you will, to take a step back and retrain and so on. There are some components of that income support program that were generous enough to qualify and perhaps have these kind of effects. This means that despite the fact that there were less Canadian employed, the Canadian income did increase by almost 10% in 2020. The poverty rate declined from 11 to 11%, whereas it was 14% in 2016. The Gini also declined. There was a decline in inequality. And in addition, because there were a lot of early retirement among the older age group, the fate of the young workers who entered the market was made a little easier. So these were a number of changes. Certainly, we agree that consumer behavior was part of the change. So reduced demand for travel was partly motivated by fear and so on, but there were a lot of these shocks that were actually policy driven. And in terms of the policy, we learned new terminology, we learned new things. We learned the word essential worker. What is essential workers? Initially, perhaps before, we're thinking this is healthcare workers, but no. We did learn that truckers were essential workers, and their working conditions during the pandemic were made very bad. Nurses in Canada were asked to do 2 shifts of 8 hours consecutively. They were doing forced overtime. They were dealing with very difficult conditions. Similarly, truckers were asked to, the place where they used to stop were closed. They could no longer do the kind of stuff that they were used to. So working conditions is something that in our labor model we do not capture very well. We capture a choice of factors. Did these workers really were they really able to choose their hours? Probably not. And so much more attention has to be paid to this aspect of work condition. Naturally, which variable do we have at hand to try to measure that? Very difficult to answer. So the idea that there was a great resignation, a great reshuffling, is perhaps not too surprising. And that, as I said, was partly driven by these policies. Working from home is another concept that had begun perhaps earlier on a small scale, but now it is on a very big scale. Last week, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, wanted his workers to come back to the office, and the workers said no. So there is increasingly much more power there. Also, the right to disconnect. When you're working from home, do you need to take all your emails even at 11 at night and so on? So these are policies supporting workers' rights and overworking conditions. These could be the part of policy that would help to alleviate the labor shortages. Inflation naturally followed from this, and what the Canadian government is doing right now is raising interest rates to the extent that we're thinking that some of this inflation is partly supply-driven rather than demand-driven. We're thinking, well, we're a little unsure to what extent it's going to be a very efficient policy, but we're going to experience another interest rate hike in September very soon. Now, the also typical response of the Canadian government to labor shortages is an immigration response, especially the shortages in retail, food services, and healthcare. The idea would be to loosen restriction on financial recognition, in particular for healthcare workers coming from other countries. It could also to increase the number of temporary foreign workers and allow them to stay a little longer. So basically, I think it's kind of interesting that this episode of the pandemic gave us an opportunity to kind of rethink some of the models and some of the considerations that we include in our analysis of the labor market. And well, you know, I've not talked actually about the most difficult aspect, which have to do with people losing their health and losing their lives. In terms of the shortages, these I think are the policies that I've been thinking about. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so I give you the German perspective. But I start a little bit like Hank, a little bit earlier, actually in the mid-1990s. And so the topic of labor scarcity is actually not a new phenomenon in Germany. So if you look at the data, then it already started in the mid-1990s, where we started to talk about the shortage of skilled labor. And we saw this in wages, so wages at the top end of the wage distribution started to increase in combination with increasing employment in that part of the labor market. Then already in 2010 and after 2010, so basically after the recession of 2008 to 2009, we already moved to talk from skilled labor scarcity to labor scarcity. So we have seen in Germany that after the Great Recession, wages have increased at the low end, at the medium end, and the high end of the wage distribution. And in all those parts, also employment has increased. And so there was other evidence of labor scarcity. So the labor market became tighter over time. Recruitment became more time-consuming overtime of firms for firms. Then they reported that they filled the vacancies after searching for a very long time with inadequately qualified people. And also because they started to a large extent to make the jobs better, to add additional amenities to the job, and so on. And that was kind of at the onset of the COVID crisis, where we already had a lot of evidence for some sort of labor scarcity. At the time, it was actually not so much felt by the consumers. The part where it was felt by the consumers was also in Germany, kind of during the pandemic, or after the pandemic now, when all kind of activities started to again. But so in COVID basically accelerated pre-existing trends. And so over time, we basically moved from labor scarcity to, skilled labor scarcity so we use the term labor shortage, and I will tell you basically in a minute why. So here you see the evolution of the potential labor force in Germany from 1990 to 2060. So that's a projection, of course, and you see 4 different scenarios. So the gray line basically captured the period that I was just talking about, and so during that period where we were already talking about skilled labor scarcity and labor shortage, there was actually an increase in employment and an increase in labor force potential, and that was mostly filled by increases in female labor force participation, but also by a tremendous inflow of foreigners into Germany. Okay, so there were a couple of episodes during the 1990s and also during the 2000s. So, for example, at the beginning of the 1990s, the inflow of the ethnic Germans after Russia collapsed, then after the 2008-2009 recession, there were a lot of young people from Southern European countries entering Germany. And so in that part, the aging German population was benefiting a lot from this inflow. So now we are in 2000, okay, and so now we have 4 different scenarios. So, and why do these lines mostly trend downwards? So the fact is that basically starting last year, the baby boom cohorts of Germany started to go into retirement. Okay, so the baby boom cohorts in Germany are all those born between 1957 and 1969. It's a huge mass of people. It's basically 30% of the labor force as we counted in 2021. So it's huge. And so what we see here is the different scenarios, how the future labor force potential will evolve depending on how behavior reacts, but also how labor migration is. Again, so the lowest scenario 1 is really if we kind of had labor force behavior constant of women, but also older workers, for example, and if there's no in-migration. Again, and the different scenarios, they kind of look more positive in the sense of sustaining the labor force, conditional on how much migration and also labor force participation is just. And the scenario where kind of the future labor force potential remains constant is a scenario where everything basically increases. So labor force participation rate increase of women and of older workers, and also we have net in-migration of 400,000 people a year. So just to give you a perspective, so in the years during the 1990s and up to 2020, basically the average inflow was 300,000 a year, and that was driven by these relatively unusual events like the refugee crisis or the fall of the communist regimes and so on. So I'm not so sure that just increasing wages will be enough for the German economy. So maybe for parts, when it comes to the increase in the participation of women, so for example, that more women shift from part-time work to full-time work. Maybe also when it comes to the fact that getting more long-term unemployed back into the labor market. But certainly also needs to be Germany needs to be more or become more attractive when it comes to competition in the global talent pool, for example. And it also needs to become more productive. So basically, it's clear that your people need to be so productive that they sustain this standard of living that we have, and in particular also the social security system, so that age dependency ratio is already increasing, and it, of course, depending on those projections, it will continue to increase in the future. So at the moment we are about 40 people, and the projections are that we will be at around 60 people around 2030. So the pandemic, I think, really also comes here into play, because in order to become productive, technology plays a large role, but of course also the skilled labor force plays an important role. And here the threat is that because of the widespread growth of schools, universities, but also training programs, and also training programs related to the refugees, for example, that came to Germany that all during the pandemic years. There's also the threat that that the result of this closure is really a future lack of competencies of people and skills, that this will also contribute to the already declining labor force participation potential that we see in the labor market. And yes, so both the digitalization and also the ecological transformation of the labor market, they all these processes need a skilled labor force. And so I think qualification programs and also highly productive education system are an important component that we need, maybe in combination with rising wages, but I actually think there needs to be a little bit more for Germany.
Well, the COVID-19 crisis was such a major shock and unprecedented. There are many things that we could possibly learn from it now that we finally see the end of the tunnel. And I'm sure that future conferences, this wonderful series organized by Christian Guzman, there will be many presentations and good papers on it. But already at this stage, perhaps we can say something about the lessons, preliminary lessons that we learned from this terrible event. One of those was in a way inspired by what Anne just told us about the adjustment in the US. I could show a diagram comparing the type of adjustment that took place in the US. Anne was showing to us this spike in unemployment, and a similar spike can be observed also in unemployment compensation rolls in the US, just at the beginning of the pandemic. If you compare it with adjustment in other countries, OECD countries, in European countries, you would see a completely different picture. You would see a big adjustment, a big reduction in working hours, and no immediate impact on unemployment. Actually, in some countries, even unemployment was down during the pandemic. And the reason for this different type of adjustment is very much into an institution, which is called short-time work. And this institution has been playing a major role in allowing many countries to deal with the pandemic. Short-time work, of course, is an institution that encourages employers to adjust along the margin of hours of work, rather than laying off workers. In the US, there is an institution which is called temporary layoffs, that instead involve the layoff of people, but they can be recalled when matters improve. Yet, the type of link attachment that you can get with short-time work with respect to temporary layoff is different. So the difference in the adjustment can explain also the developments afterwards, and why in the US there was immediately an issue of labor shortages. This is the pandemic is really a canonical case where you need to use short-term work, because this is a temporary shock. It's a shock that is taking place and is occurring outside the labor market, actually outside the economy. It was related to health issues, and it was clear from the start that as soon as the health shock could be dealt with, and the major issues that would be addressed, the labor market and the economy would have recovered very quickly. And then it was very important to allow employers to be able to restart operation immediately. This is what short-term work is supposed to do, not lose the human capital of an employer. Keep people attached to the firm. It's a way to protect workers, but it's also a way to protect employers. So I think it was a mistake not to do this. While all countries, OECD countries, expanded a lot short-term work involving small business, for instance, but typically are not involved by short-term work, the US didn't do it. I don't know why this was not done. I think it was a policy mistake in this respect. Another lesson concerns these marginal workers that are in between dependent employment and self-employment. We call it fake self-employment, both self-employment. There are various ways to deal with them, as well as temporary workers and seasonal workers. These workers are not under the protection of short-term work. And that explains why we did face a major shortage of these workers, of this type of occupation, where these contracts are widespread after the most hard times of the pandemic. For instance, in tourism activities and so on, in Italy there's been a dramatic shortage of workers. Firms lost contact with these people, and clearly these workers are doing other things, moved away. So clearly that was a major problem in the recovery of the labor market. And again, I think it's something that has to do with the fact that for this worker there is not such a thing like short-term work. There is not a way to keep this worker attached to the firm during a temporary shock like the one we have been experiencing. The third lesson instead has to do with income support, inequality, social protection. And I think it has to do with mainly non-contributory jobs and informal sector. Typically, during a recession, the informal sector is an unemployment benefit system. It's a way to sort of somewhat stabilize it and provide alternative employment opportunities to people losing the job in the formal sector. Typically, a recession, people working in the formal sector, not in the informal sector. In this case, instead, the informal sector workers were very dramatic by the pandemic clearly was very strong, also among sectors in occupation that really where the informal sector is large. So these people typically are not covered by any type of social insurance. It's not covered by contributor social insurance, which is a dominant form to provide insurance against the labor market risk in all our countries. So the government did right in this respect. So they provided support, social assistance support, even to these workers. But the way it was provided was clearly difficult because there was not such a scheme, there was not an administration, we were not really had to define from scratch, build up from scratch schemes for these workers. So that's something we should really think hard about because it creates also in perspective a moral hazard problem. People are not paying contribution and yet you want to protect them somehow during recession. So it thinks of this type to that. So I think that's really an area where more work, more thinking is due. Fourth lesson concerns remote working. We had this development of remote working, and I think that part of it will remain, although I think that most firms will move to hybrid work organization. Some remote working will be still there. I don't been a lot of stories about people leaving urban centers, moving to rural areas, would be good news for Monferrato, I'm sure, but because I think that hybrid work will be the dominant form of work in the future. But I think remote working will still be very important. So people spending this part of the week at home and working from home. And also the energy crisis, I think, is pushing a bit in that direction, because it could be a way for firms to save on energy costs. But there is an issue that has been somewhat overlooked, and I think more work has to be done. This is related to inequality of opportunities. We are adding a new dimension of inequality across workers that so far have not been considered by any type of scheme dealing with inequality. And this is differences in working conditions related to differences in residential conditions. This clearly adds to differences across workers that will predate the development of remote working, and clearly creates perspective very serious social problems in this respect. Yeah, finally, the last consideration that was inspired by some of the presentation before has to do with the school system. Clearly, we had this major educational attainment gaps that did occur, because clearly distance teaching is not the same thing as teaching in presence, and there is a lot of very good work that has already been done documenting that it was those who had a more serious problem in educational attainment to start with, who had suffered most from the school closure and the move to distant learning. I think that the data that we are getting are not sufficient to really understand the legacy of the COVID, which is a very serious one. So if you look specifically at dropouts, we wouldn't see much action there, because school became more leaning towards people having educational gaps during the COVID-19, because they knew about the situation. So dropouts are really, in some countries, even declined during the COVID-19. Where we should really be very careful is using all the information of the quality of education to look at the implicit dropouts. So people completing even the educational curriculum, but without having the competence that are required when people are completing, that are typically associated with completing education. And that's really a legacy for the future that we should really consider. And I think it's the most serious problem, because some of the problems I mentioned before are problems, temporary problems. This problem of educational gaps or human capital losses are something that is likely to persist with time.
Thanks for first round speakers. We're going to hand over to Bob Gregory now, who's going to sum up to tell us about what to do about tight labour markets, rising inflation, falling real wages, education scars, learning losses.
I'm going to ask you to think back over what happened, and think back over why every prediction that was made at the macro level was wrong. And then I'm going to ask you to think about what you think will happen in 2 or 3 years' time. And lastly, and more importantly, what do you think will happen if we have another COVID event in 5 years' time? When you pose questions like that, the whole thing becomes extremely interesting. For example, before the COVID really started to hit, it was widely anticipated that COVID would impact on the labour market by reducing the number of people who work because of COVID. If you look at the data, nobody died, basically, under 70. So the direct impact on workers not being able to work directly because of COVID is very low. So most of the non-workers occurred because of the reaction to COVID rather than COVID itself. By reaction to COVID, I mean the way the individuals reacted, and the way governments reacted. It really is quite extraordinary. And this is very much highlighted in Australia. For example, our health minister said at one stage that in the next 3 months following epidemiologists, we would have between 40,000 deaths and 150,000 deaths. We had 3 a day. 900. 3 a day is less than the number of deaths we get a year with the flu. So the death rate in Australia is extremely low. And even in the United States and the UK, which have the worst record for deaths, the number of deaths still come in well below what people were expecting. And still the deaths come in at people over 70. So the first real puzzle is it's not about taking workers out. What takes workers out is the response to COVID rather than the illness per se and the government action. The second thing I want to say about that is I think that if we do have another COVID-type episode 5 years down the track, I think the response this time, next time around, won't be anywhere near as dramatic as it was this time. Now, I really do believe that, and that's a pretty strong statement. And the reason why that would happen, of course, is that before COVID, we really have to look back to the Spanish flu, and hardly anybody remember that. The next thing I want to say, which is quite remarkable, is the policies that were developed to fight COVID were all done in 7 days, 10 days, 15 days, 20 days. I mean, the speed at which things happen is remarkable. That spike that Hank showed you. Ask yourself the question, if you think of the world as it stands, why would all virtually spike, was said in one of the studies, virtually all around the world, that spike is in the data, all within a week of each other. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon. And then basically, the spike collapses very, very quickly. And I think that's quite extraordinary. The next thing I want to say is that when people were predicting large numbers of deaths, our officials were talking about 25% unemployment rates, 80% unemployment rates, the sort of thing that Hank said. None of that came true. And what happened was unemployment rate went to 80. And now, the unemployment rate in Australia is the lowest it's been in 70 years. The employment rate is the highest it's ever been. The last year has been the strongest year for the growth of female employment, probably in the last 7 years, matched maybe with 3 others. Long-term unemployment can't be jobs, all be jobs. There's massive employment shortages. Australia now, life has never been better if you want a job. Nobody can beat that. Nobody can beat that. Then ask yourself the next question. If you've had massive labour shortages, which you've not experienced 70 years, how come for the first time in 70 years, real wages are falling? You can't go to an economics 1 textbook and say, oh, guess what? I'm going to predict the strongest labour market, the biggest shortages, and guess what? You're going to have a real wage fall. Unbelievable. The real wage fall, which we've never had as far as my history is concerned, is around about 4% this day. The next question you should ask yourself is, standing now in your country, has the real wage fall stopped? That is, if you look ahead, do you think in the next 6 months, wages are going to go faster than inflation? And I think the answer to that is no. So there's more real wage fall to come. Now, the final point on the real wage is the following. If you've never had a real wage fall like this, and you get it, and it falls by, say, 4 or 5%, 6 or 7 or 8. Do you think in the next year or two it's going to reverse itself? Are we going to restore the ways we had before? The answer to that is no. And the reason why the answer to that is no is that if you think about what a real wage is, it's the balance between the changes in prices and the changes in wages. And large institutions all around the world are committed to bringing the inflation rate down. Now, when they do that and interest rate rises, you don't find by and large, oh, guess what? Inflation falls by 4% and wages stay where they are. It's not going to, what's really going to happen, I think, is we're going to get bigger increases in unemployment. So that raises the next issue. That just like we've had an erratic downturn, first with COVID, an erratic bounce up, is there an erratic downturn coming? Now, one reason why you might think so, you've just got to read the statements of governors and reserve banks around the world. Start with the US last week. Go to the stuff, go to the Australian bank, and see the same sort of thing. So I think that looking ahead, it's going to be really quite different. And the question is really worrying, when I say it's quite different, what I'm doing is I'm applying all the sorts of things I learned in the past. But what I learned in the past didn't predict the real wage fall. Didn't predict the real wage fall, so I'm not really sure about that. But I think that's what's going to happen. The next thing that's going to happen is that the Australian government and every other government, as far as I know, got involved in fiscal expansion to the degree that they have been involved before. So that means that when the unemployment rate starts to go up, they're not going to rush into these fiscal policies. They're not going to use expansions in Social Security as otherwise. So, it's quite possible that we have to use in the future in the next short period of time. The next thing I want to ask you to think about is, where did all this response come from? I mean, it is quite remarkable. When I was told that we were going to have 100 deaths, I said, no way. That's one thing I got right. But then I said about 4,000, not 900. Did I think we were going to have massive unemployment? No way. Did I think we have a massive recovery? No way. So, when people say we're going to learn a lot, we've got to ask ourselves a slightly different question, which is, if the existing models and the way we think about things stick roughly at a company, and you enter into a new world, is it really a new world? If it's a new world, what you might learn in the new world may not be that useful for the company. They said it's a little bit harder to figure that out when you're thinking into a new environment. Now, I want to say one thing about inequality and then I'll finish. First of all, if you look at inequality in a micro level, across individuals and so on, COVID's been good for inequality. We pay unemployed workers twice what they used to get. We pay part-time workers in firms salaries above the wage. So everything's been really good inequality-wise when you take that aspect. But suppose you're really old-fashioned and you think about inequality as the balance between the wages on average and profits on average. Then you find an extraordinary thing that happens in my country, and I suspect in other countries, and that is people who are reported as receiving profits have the best years in their lifetime. So the profit rate in Australia, and the package here now is that roughly 51% of GDP, paid by the government outside goes to profits, 49%. And that came from the fact that our fiscal policy overexpanded. And so, you know, like they have expanded subsidized workers and jobs, but the workers in the jobs didn't quite lose their jobs. They didn't, so many of them kept working. And so much of the subsidy went to profits. And then the next question you ask yourself is, will that stay? And if there's a big wind down in profits, in response to that, then that will again reinforce maybe in the next year or two coming. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, excellent. So I think we can open up to some questions if people have them. Does anybody want to show a hand and ask a question? Actually, how are we going to facilitate this? You can say something more while we try to solve this.
You might want to bring a microphone down there. One thing I'm a little puzzled by is, while it's true that the number of fatalities from COVID didn't really reach the levels that were predicted, part of that might be because of the measures that government took, and so on. So, the implication I drew, the inference I drew from what you were saying, was that maybe it was foolish to shut down the way we did. In the United States, there's fairly clear evidence that states where people tended not to follow the guidelines, so-called red states, fatality rates of COVID were much higher than blue states. And I don't know whether it's economically the right thing or whatever, but I didn't want people to draw the inference that it was necessarily the state doing it.
It's a little bit more subtle than that. First of all, you are speaking from a country that has the word. That's the first point. The second point is that if you talk the death rates of COVID across the country, and then you seek that to explain economic outcomes, the mapping is not good. The mapping is not good. For example, the best country in many ways in terms of strong recovery and low death rates is us. We sort of said, we should do that part. But the mapping into GDP falls is not really as close as you would think. And so the point that I was trying to make was that the death rates are really a reflection of the way the government respond and individuals, rather than the intensity of COVID. It's the same COVID everywhere amongst development. It's the same health system. So what you're really seeing is the way people are reacting. And then I want to use that to say that next time, I don't think the reaction of the government will be strong for quite a time. That's what I want to say.
Christian to work distributing the microphone.
Okay, somebody has a question. Okay, before you ask the question, let me comment. So Bob said that we haven't learned, or it's not clear that we actually learned from the last sessions. Now, if I look at the current labor markets, what is the biggest problem? Actually, what Tito mentioned. It is that we don't get workers back to work fast enough because we got rid of them. Now, that's particularly so in the United States. There is one country which has been quite exceptional in that, and from which we should have learned already during the Great Recession, and that's Germany. So the short-term work, which Tito mentioned, has been incredibly important for Germany during the Great Recession and after the Great Recession to actually come back as a country which did better after the Great Recession than before the Great Recession. And the reason was that they could keep their workers and they preserved the human capital stock precisely what Tito actually meant as the second point. So we should have learned from it. Instead, in the UK, for instance, they had to introduce short-term measures after COVID because they didn't learn from it. And in the US, they didn't have those measures. So the point is not that we can't learn from past disasters, but the political unwillingness to learn from past disasters, I think, has greatly exaggerated the impact of COVID on Anglo-Saxon economies. So I would like to hear what you have to say about that. Let me just give Bert the microphone and he can then continue the conversation.
Yes, thank you. This was very fascinating. Christian already made some points regarding short-time work. I was going to support what Tito said, but there is a trade-off, and I think Tito, you've written about that also. With short-time work, you save jobs, and if they are productive and everything, this is fine. But at least what I think, what our research also shows is that COVID changes the economy. We will not go back to the same economy, the same demand structure, and so on, and just saving the old jobs is in the short run very, very effective. But now in Germany we are discussing how do we address these challenges which Alexandra pointed to, and for that, of course, short-time work is not the final answer. And how to balance that for the next crisis, that's a key topic in our policy. I wanted to mention, I don't know what the reason is for this interference. I wanted to go back to one very intriguing fact Nicole mentioned, which is completely different to the German experience. In the German short-time work experience, one thing the government tried to do, and labor economists also said that this is a very good idea, you get a higher replacement rate if you do training. You said some of the workers who were out of job had basic income support, they did training and they ended up in higher, better paid jobs maybe. And it was a complete failure in Germany. Firms were not willing to train their workers, and one reason for that is that our sort of training providers basically also had the same kind of shutdowns there. I guess this is a kind of this lack of, we are behind in the digitalization of training, of work in general. Also in our schooling system suffered from that, and this way to get workers trained for the new kinds of jobs in the future, this was not successful in Germany. But maybe the others can comment on that from their country's experience. Thanks.
Okay, let's take one more question from the audience, and then we'll ask you who else would like to ask a question?
It's an interference.
Thank you for your very interesting statements in this conversation. So I wanted to ask a bit about work from home. Professor Boeri mentioned that it's going to be not work from home, hybrid work. It's going to be the work of the future. But I was thinking that not all types of jobs, of course, can offer this, right? So not all sectors can offer jobs that can be done remotely in any sense. So I was wondering whether you think the labor shortages we see now in the market, but whether some of these shortages can be explained by the fact that some sectors cannot provide these remote jobs, and then workers choose the sectors of the occupation that give them the opportunity to work hybrid. And if that's the case, then how will the market go back to equilibrium in a sense? We then wage the sectors that do not give these jobs increase to compensate for this amenity, or will some types of jobs extinct? So do we see a transformation in the demand in that sense?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to pass back to then we'll take some round of questions after that, and then we will move on.
Very good question for that. What I
raising this issue. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yes, short-time work has many advantages, and really was the canonical case, the one we experienced during the pandemic for short-time work. Yet it's true that short-time work may hinder in the long run, medium to long run, labor allocation, and above all the type of allocation that we expect to take place, because certainly this crisis will lead us with a different structure of employment. There are already indications that is taking place. That clearly is something that short-time work should be temporary, and that's, I think, the way they've been operating in a large number of countries. The way to increase the transient nature of short-time work is to add some kind of experience rating into the system, so that employers using short-time work to pay more when they use it, because moral hazard in this case is very much on the side of the employer, so we should be dealing with that. What to do to ease this reallocation in general? Well, I think there is a lot of thinking that should be done. Experimentation has been taking place. The problem with reallocation after a recession is that there are also a lot of people who are under means-tested schemes, social assistance schemes, and often jobs are being offered in part-time occupations, paying low wages. And clearly there are perhaps a strong incentive, or these schemes are organized in such a way that individuals do face a very high marginal effective tax rate leading these schemes. A lot of work has been done in this respect to adjust and to deal with this problem. I'm referring to the fact that you create systems of earning disregards, way to, in a way, allow people to combine invested assistance with low-paid jobs. There is also a lot of development taking place in terms of partial unemployment insurance. So I think that's, and something also, I think some thinking about also wage insurance should be made. So we should, in a way, allow people moving to jobs, especially older people, moving to jobs that are less paid than what they had before, to be partly compensated. Clearly here there is an equity issue, because you are in a way subsidizing some workers and not others, but this type of issue should be dealt with. In terms of a remote working issue, I didn't say that remote working is the worker. I said more hybrid work, so which require also some presence at work. What I'm particularly concerned is about this inequality effect, because also they have been under-investigated and there are not good data on this. There is, to my knowledge, only in the UK, I think a survey that tracks at the same time residential conditions and the spread of remote working. So I think that would be something really we should spend more time, and we should press national statistical offices to really go in detail and really understand what are the actual working conditions of people working remotely. Finally, consideration about wage dynamics. In Europe, in the US, wages did actually stay more. There was a reaction of wages to labor shortages. In Europe, we haven't seen, we start seeing something now, but this has to do with a different structure of wage bargaining, two sides of the planet. Here we have the collective bargaining playing a major role, and the collective bargaining, especially at the national level, that we engineer, occurs at relatively low frequencies. So that's why it takes time before wages adjust. But we already see that this adjustment is taking place.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I have a few words about work sharing. I think we were all I want to say, we really respected the German experience in the Great Recession with job share. It really worked very well. I looked at the United States, talked to people, and wish we could do this sort of thing. It's a little bit less well suited for dealing with something like COVID because so many workplaces shut down. And when workplaces shut down, there's really not work to be shared. And so at least in some sectors of the economy, there's limits to what work sharing can do. The other thing I hadn't thought about, which came up, is does work sharing get in the way of labor reallocation at all? That was that was brought up, and I think that's a good point. In the Great Recession, no one thought that the economy would look fundamentally different than it came out of in terms of the industrial distribution of employment. This is not so clear in the current economy. People's demands have shifted perhaps in permanent ways for some things, and maybe that when the work sharing can slow down that allocation by maintaining worker levels. I don't have a strong view of that, but it's something.
So first of all, I have one point of disagreement with Bob, which is the idea that the different types of policy had different impact on mortality. I would say they did. And so across the different provinces, there were a big variety of policies. And there's some provinces, such as the province of Quebec, that rather than educating people about what you need to do to protect yourself from disease, impose ridiculous rules. Oh, no more gathering of more than 10 people, and all kinds of things like that, rather than educating people what it is you need to do to take a more scientific approach. So I disagree that when politicians got in the way, that resulted in more death. When they let the scientists tell us what were the things to do, that had a better impact. So on that point, I disagree. On the other hand, I do agree on the point that many of the measures were put in place very quickly, probably too quickly. So our emergency response benefit were put in place in a matter of a few weeks through the tax system, so they could be implemented very quickly because everybody pays taxes. They were way too generous. That it cost 10 times in 2020 the amount spent on unemployment insurance in that year. So the amounts were so large. And so this answers a bit Fern's question as to why wasn't there space for workers to think about how they wanted to retrain rather than being forced into a specific government sponsored program. Basically, they have the resources to think. Also, some of these programs were made to tie the employers and the workers. Firms could appeal to the program and get replacement rates when they had to shut down. However, in many places, they emphasize not so much on shutting down businesses, but on mitigating close contacts with business and keeping them going while mitigating close contacts. So I think there is, for the next time, the lesson of relying more heavily on the science, I think, should be taken to heart. Unfortunately, many politicians took the idea that they wanted to be the front leaders into imposing the restriction. And we saw this in many countries, and I think that should be avoided.
Yes, so there was already a lot said about short support in Germany. So we all had income support programs, and what we actually also had was like support programs for firms so that they could get bankrupt. That was also one of the issues, so the concern that when we shut down restaurants and so on for a couple of months, that they will not exist afterwards. And so the bankruptcy rate actually did not go up tremendously during COVID. But now what we see is these increases in wages. So when you look at the current round of union negotiation is really, it's about kind of relief programs for the invoices for people. But then the firms also, they are also subject to the price increases for energy and also food and so on. And on top, the increasing labor costs that they will have to face. So in the German context, I'm not so sure whether all the firms will survive that. So I think in the next couple of years, I think we will actually see that the market gets cleans of the firms who are less productive, in the sense that the price increases that we see in many products, and in particular energy, that of course not only affect what households have to pay, but also firms have to pay. And so I think that this will be one of the biggest issues for the future as well for the German economy.
Just want to make 2 points. The Christian, I obviously wasn't, I didn't explain exactly what was going on. Australia and New Zealand have German immigrants. Basically what both these countries did is they pay the firms to pay the workers, irrespective of whether the worker was at work or not. So what we did in Australia is we offered basically $750 a week for every worker in the firm, whether he worked or not, subject to 2 conditions. One condition was the firm registered as per weekly with their turnover before by 30%. There was no requirement that actually did have to fall. This went to every worker, except for casuals that had been unemployed for less than a year, and also for some of the migrant workers being less than a year. So that meant that it wasn't like a furlough system. It wasn't we paid you the worker went home and didn't work. We just paid you across the board. So my daughter is a part-time worker. She gets $1,200 a fortnight. The government paid $1,600 a fortnight. And the employer then gave it to her, because that was the job. The foreman was getting $120 $120,000 a year, working flat out. The government gave $1,600 for the So there was no fine-tuning, and that goes part of this complex thing. These things were done. When they obviously sat down and said we can find you or we can't, and when they figured out what was involved, they said, we're trying to do like and read. Now, the result of that was that the wage bill on average was constant, and the 5 or 6% of GDP on a quarterly basis that went away all ended up in tax. And the government has already announced that they won't do this thing again. So we did that. And the net result was that we did not have any great resignation, and workers and firms were all in place. Bankruptcies went the lowest level ever. But we still have the same macro outcomes of the job shortages, the wage fall, the government. So we did do what we did. It only turned out much more expensive. We thought I'll talk more about this on. If I had to choose between Nicole and I, as a zero, would you choose her? But I would make the point much more complicated than that. And that is, if you look at the individual study, if you close down every firm and make everybody stay home, then into the COVID box. Right? And it goes right down to 0, and we right up and down. So if you do the micro study, it's certainly true the policy is now. And the death rate. What I'm saying, why go across the countries to try and map the policy, the death rate, and the outcomes? The thing that's applied is it doesn't make policy. So as long as ladies and gentlemen, an absolute disastrous. Ends up with, nobody history. When you countries, other countries drop they up to much like the US as well. So the macro level, all the interactions things seem to happen as well as you think in the micro.
Of course, one of the consequences of having such an eminent panel who know a lot about this stuff is they have quite a lot to say. So I'm afraid we've run out of time. So I apologise for being really up at the hands. But what I suggest is that when we have the reception soon, you come and grab them and ask them about what they think about what your questions are. So I think I can conclude here. Really interesting panel. We thank the speakers and